Welcome to Adopting Zero Trust, or AZT, a podcast designed to provide context behind current challenges in the world of cybersecurity. Your hosts, Elliot Volkman and Neal Dennis, provide this platform to elevate important conversations, to drive action, and share the good word about the concept of zero trust. Now, on to your hosts.
Hello and welcome back to Adopting Zero Trust, or AZT. I'm Elliot Volkman, your producer, alongside Neal Dennis, your host. And today we are going to talk about something that has been high up on my wish list. But first, I'd like to introduce you to our guest. Mr. Bradon Rogers is Island's Chief Customer Officer, where he leads relationships with their customers. He is also a senior fellow for the McCrary Institute, and in the past has worked with Mimecast, Symantec, and McAfee. Probably all organizations that you're generally familiar with. So, as you could imagine, he probably has a pretty good read on the topic that we're going to be talking about, which is shadow IT. Now, if you're also familiar with Island and their enterprise browser, did I get that right? Is the enterprise browser? All right, cool. Got positioning. We're good. You're probably familiar with that is a technology that also helps reduce some of that stuff. So I'm just going to throw this out there, right? What is the current state of shadow IT? I know it's really fluffy. You can go any direction you want, but let's start there.
Yeah, well, look, I think it's, first of all, it's nice to be with both of you, Elliot and Neal. I appreciate you guys having me on. So shadow IT is an interesting topic. Obviously, I don't know how many years ago, 10, 15 years ago, the idea that average users could go grab apps and start bringing them to the organization, and they could bring their consumer du jour application to the table and make themselves more productive. And, at the end of the day, a lot of orgs began to wrap their hands around, I think part of it was initially the users were trying to find easy outlets to do things, make their job easier. And many orgs were slow to move. Like, let's just pick up basic file sharing, right? I mean, a lot of people, the average user didn't have a cloud-based option in that process. And to make their lives easier, they went and grabbed something like Dropbox or something. And, then obviously the orgs caught up, and orgs began providing modern services for people to be able to do their jobs. And so there's less of that, and there's obviously many orgs that have taken the stance with certain types of shadow IT stuff that's popping up right now. I'll get more into that in a moment. The block thing, right? Everybody's trying to play whack-a-mole and block these things. And that just generally that perception, of cybersecurity practitioners, we all lived this for years, is that all our technologies do get in the way, they block abusers. Well, I think that the traditional shadow IT challenge has subsided a bit, but we have a new challenge, and it's called generative AI. And it's like shadows within shadows now at this point, if you want to think of it that way, because, you've got the obvious generative AI destinations that are the chat GPTs of the world. And then you got other things that are less obvious, where the generative AI is built into the application. And so you're creating this whole area of opportunity for many organizations and challenges for other organizations as users bring those things to the table. I guess the last thing I'll mention on it, it's a little bit different than the previous genre of shadow IT we were just talking about a moment ago, was in that there's like a gold rush here on all fronts. Like, everybody's in a gold rush. You've got the average end user trying to find cheat codes in how they do their jobs. And certainly it's kind of unlike the prior generation of apps. It's much easier to access this because it's just using your natural language. So it's easy and it's accessible for a non-technologist to be able to begin to use it to try to find either cheat codes or just intellectual stimulation, who knows what it is. And then obviously, for the organizations, there's executives that are pushing the org to get the competitive advantage to be able to, get ahead of this, and maybe not even fully understanding the risks or otherwise, but pushing the org in that route as well. And then there's the third angle, which is the technology providers. They're all finding the competitive advantage themselves to try to embed it into the technologies as well. So that's where it starts appearing inside the applications. So it's, back to your original question, we've got shadow IT kind of on steroids right now with generative AI flowing around everywhere.
Yeah, and I'm glad that you brought up the AI piece, and I don't want to take us too far down that path, because then everything will just be a conversation about AI, because the 30 flavors there. But one thing that did stand out to me there is, AI is being shoved into a lot of already pre-approved solutions. Some of these are also just you can also access LinkedIn, for example. Some of these other sites that basically opt you into AI training and consumption. Any particular thoughts around that? Because, a lot of these organizations aren't necessarily forward thinking on communicating those. It's just it's there, and then it finds out, blows up.
Well, we've seen several situations where just suddenly a box pops up in the middle of the application that people weren't expecting. And the good side of that fence is that it's less of an end user issue on that front, and it's more of the sanctioned applications. And I think there are many application providers that are responsible about letting their populations know what's coming in the next releases, et cetera. And something important is generative AI. I think many are doing a good job of helping people understand what the impact is. It's going to obviously be incumbent on many organizations to do an inventory of all their applications and where they think that's important. Unfortunately, or fortunately, I should say, maybe it's just going to be a part of everyday life within the applications we use. And no different than the back-end database they were storing our information in before. Now they're going to be using generative AI to give us much more intelligent answers or giving us help in the process as well. But again, I think just like any application, it's incumbent upon the org to understand what is in the application, what are its capabilities, what are the risks of using such applications, and what are your contractual bindings that protect you in that process. And I don't think any of that stuff changes.
Yeah, so we can kind of poke two of those real quick in my mind. So I'm day job working in a company that's product provider, and so we're like you mentioned, we're going down that path as well for some kind of LLM or generative AI in some perspective or another. And I think there's a couple of lanes in the road. You've got, like Elliot mentioned, LinkedIn, where we're already locked into a service agreement and it's on their stuff, on their data. Like the Facebooks and LinkedIn, social medias, they own your data once you type it in within reason, right? Versus enterprise grade solutions like whether it's a SIM or whether it's case management, orchestration tools, whatever, where whether you're deployed to the cloud or not, your data is technically supposed to be your data. So on that, two models. One is your old model, like you're talking about, where before the LLM was there, maybe your data lake or whatever it was on a single server, single tenant potentially, depending on your deployment and how much you pay them. But now what I'm finding is most LLMs require some kind of global data pool unless you're like a really large enterprise customer, right? So if we think about case management, in my mind, for an LLM or generative AI to take place, most of those companies that are doing that for probably the 90+% of their consumer base, they're deploying everything into a global hub, and then your queries are going back and forth. And in some cases, they're still leveraging the enterprise grade versions of whatever that LLM is out there, like a ChatGPT or Gemini, to actually do the language. So that's my curiosity question. So navigating that roadway and understanding what leakage or what data is being leveraged and how to figure out, what models are being used within your structure. I think that's kind of my curiosity point. Yeah.
No doubt about it. I think and again, I think that goes right back to what I said before. I do think there's a responsibility the org is going to have to examine their supply chain and understand how it's being used. And if if your data is being cross-contaminated with other possible customers in order to make the models more effective, you need to understand that. And I think it's a fair thing on the provider to be able to provide back to you at the same time. And again, I do think that I think this is true. I'm sure it's true of your org, Neal, as well. You guys have responsible practices where you look at the providers who you're leveraging on the back end and understand the risk profiles of those things. And this will just be more of those types of questions that you have to ask and understand. And if you don't like the answers, you may pick a different provider. And in some cases, you may be fine with the answers. The fact is, it may be a general large language model in the back end that doesn't commingle data and then ties in leveraging something like RAG to be able to train on your own specific materials and information and make it intelligent about your own org. And it may be something where they need the greater good to be brought to that. And again, something you'll have to figure out and accept the risk tolerance or shy away from those things depending on the type of business that you're in.
Yeah, I prefer an opt-in, opt-out model for those enterprise things, right?
Yeah, I agree.
When we're applicable. But to your point, not every company's doing that.
That's right.
I logged into a few enterprise tools that are technically in a self-hosted cloud environment for one of my clients, and same thing, pop-up box. It's like, congrats, and they were like, whoa.
There you go.
So, yeah. So it's like, well, you're obviously not paying them enough money for them to care and notify you. But anyway, no, that's fun stuff. So I'm kind of very curious, maybe poking at what y'all do a little bit as an entity. I'm secure browser environments and things like that have always been kind of a fun world. I remember, I don't know, maybe 2007 or so. I'm not going to remember the name of the company, but the first virtualized browser.
Yeah.
It was kind of fun. You pulled it up and had a big giant red box around it to let you know that you were in the environment, and it was basically a VM-esque, like native app VM type session. So whatever you did in there, and we tested the heck out of it for the time. Ransomware wasn't a thing, but extortion and other formats were, other weird things. So we went through the paces and it did fun. So I'm very curious your take on one. Obviously, we'll get to maybe how that helps with the shadow IT issue, but two, Do you think that those types of browsers or your browser and policy procedures can help mitigate or limit exposure to the AI type stuff? Is there a process flow or play with that policy?
Indeed, yeah. So I think it's important. I'm going to hit the first part of you mentioned. You mentioned the old secure browser. I remember them very well as a person that was faced with consuming one of them at one point, as you'll probably appreciate too. The philosophy was that the browser could be an area of risk for us. Let's contain the things that could pour forth from it. Let's try to prevent its escape into the actual OS and causes issues. And the unfortunate side effect that it was just a terrible experience for the end user. So the end user couldn't work effectively. I don't know if you remember in the old days when the first little containers came out for your mobile phone that were email containers. You got your own email client. It had a different keyboard than the iPhone keyboard. Everything was slightly different. It was not great. It was that kind of experience as well with the secure browsers. Again, they took the philosophical approach that browser is, I'm going to be extreme here, but browser is bad, therefore constrain it. And then over the years, we've seen some evolution of that same philosophy into things like, I'm sure you're familiar with remote browser isolation, where they take a browser engine, throw it up in the cloud, put a virtual wrapper around it, and the user gets a video stream instead. Kind of a similar type of philosophy. One's localized, one's not, but the idea was to try to keep things from escaping, in the event of something like a malicious code injection, or maybe even make the site read-only for the end user going to that destination so they wouldn't be phished or things like that. And, generally speaking, remote browser isolation found a corner case, a small corner case for some limited usage. But again, the general challenge was user experience. And, what's interesting is we look at what we're doing at Island. We coined the term enterprise browser for a reason. And the idea was it's a much more optimistic point of view of what the browser could be if we were to uncork its potential. And, if you think about the browser, it's the one place where we're consuming all the applications. I'd say at least by and large, most of our applications every day, maybe not everything, but we're consuming most everything. And we said, what if rather than using a consumer grade experience, the consumer browsers are great pieces of technology. They've been around a long time and they have durability, and there's a lot of flexibility needed to support billions of users around the globe. But the need for those people versus the need for an enterprise are two wildly different things. So what if we could leverage the browser and give the user something super familiar, something they don't have to be trained on, but transform the browser into a true application delivery platform? And that's what we did when we built the enterprise browser, because it's about using the browsers as a vehicle for truly delivering the app to the user. And while you're doing that, because the user's working in the browser and the tip of the spear, what if we were to deliver cybersecurity efforts in that process to keep the application data safe, to keep the applications, to keep the user safe in the process? What if we keep the user safe from phishing and things like that? But what if we were also to do things while we're keeping them safe to make the user more productive? What if we could automate the movement of data and applications for call center workers who are doing mundane tasks all day long? What if we could open up the possibility, this is a cybersecurity / productivity challenge, but what if we could open up the possibility of users being able to use the built-in password manager in their browser versus having to restrict it all the time? The password manager is built into many of them that nobody will use in the enterprise. But what if we could have one that's built in that's safe? What if we could, build in mechanics for, back to the AI conversation, where AI is built into the experience and the ability to have an angel over your shoulder helping you through certain things could just be there to make the user more productive. But again, at all times keeping the user safe in the process. And that's why we coined the term enterprise browser, because we believed there was something much more ambitious that could fulfill not only the cybersecurity practitioners' needs, but the folks in the line of business scratch their itch for solving difficult use cases that they have, and chasing some difficult corners of the business that have been long evasive for a long time. Think of things like BYO as an example, which we've been talking about for 20 years. But then on top of that, giving the user that natural experience that was missing from all those other browser elements, the prior attempts at creating the quote unquote secure browser process. That's what we built at Island at the end of the day.
So you touched on this at the beginning, but the change from maybe actual installed apps and things like that, right? Thick client, thin client type mentalities and actual desktop software versus browser. I'll admit, Slack, other tools that have all these desktop clients, I don't use any of them. We've moved so far away from that, and also they're annoying to remember to turn off when you're doing something like this. Yeah. So I think the only desktop client, the only piece of software now that I still use, maybe on a other than the browser, is probably Thunderbird for email client, because I just like it way better than it. For me, open source, easy to manage thing. This is not a promotion of a tool, nor is it something I consider overtly secure compared to other things. Tagline done. But it's where I grew up with function flow. So I still use that to help manage emails, because Gmail and Outlook and the browser still hasn't let you do folders very well.
Right.
That being said, to your point, from a shadow IT perspective, going from people installing random pieces of software on their laptop, or in my case, I used to have a couple different virtual machines that I would get installed because they're like, oh, okay, he's doing development stuff, and then I'd run everything through there because they couldn't monitor it. They never monitored the actual, SOX layers and stuff between that. Right. They just cared about the actual VM, and that was it. Mm-hmm. But anyway, so transitioning software to browser-based. I think from an enterprise browser perspective, obviously that's probably a good niche. So my curiosity question on all that is, do you still, just at the general layer, do you still see a lot of software things outside of the browser for most users, like in the enterprise space beyond just the browser itself, right? Or do you feel like, not just by proxy of your product, but do you feel that it truly has kind of transitioned into a more pure browser-based digital world for all the apps and things that they're consuming as a whole?
That's a great question, Neal. It's a little bit of all. It's all the above. And just because we use a browser front end, the familiar front end to the end user, doesn't mean we shouldn't be able to support other types of applications. So that is one of the elements of the enterprise browser that makes it so interesting, is the ability to support other form factors of apps. Obviously, there's the SaaS universe, which browsers naturally work with. But there's also leveraging things like private access to get to internal apps without a VPN client. Just built-in zero trust network access built natively into the browser to give the user access to internal apps. Now that's a web-borne starting point. However, we also built in capabilities for things like secure shell. So you've got people that are developers and other types of admins that need command line access to resources. So a built-in secure shell client built into the browser. So the user uses the browser window, and all of a sudden they have a secure shell window using private access to get to the back-end servers and things they need to do administrative work. Now, when you get to certain types of thick apps, there's alternatives. And many organizations have been leveraging things like VDI for years. Going back to the conversation we had about secure browsers a minute ago, VDI similarly has a bad reputation of a terrible user experience for the end users. And probably even more the challenges of just the ultimate cost associated with it, the traditional VDI players, et cetera. So many orgs are looking for some alternative vehicles to maybe arbitrage their way out of the cost models that they've been holding to for so long. So one of the things we can leverage in the enterprise browsers are things like our remote desktop protocol client. So you get all the same policies, but now I can aim the RDP client at your chosen virtualization environment of choice, and then support things. Maybe the org wants to move to native RDS on the back end. Again, because I think the key to remember with any thick app, a Win32, Win64 app, it has to run somewhere on a Windows substrate. So at the end of the day, you may have the desire to virtualize that application and deliver it centrally. There are advantages to doing so, but maybe more advantageous to move away from the traditional player and more to something that's more cost effective for the organization. You may be moving to Azure Virtual Desktop. Maybe you just want to do a published app or two out of something like AVD, out of the cloud. All of those things are options, and even the ability to leverage localized apps and be able to extend policies outside the browser to localized apps. So one foundational concept, and I think you hit on this a minute ago, Neal, is, and I wanted to go back to your shadow IT comment. Foundationally speaking, there's a philosophy we have with the enterprise browser, and we call it say yes. Because remember I talked about block earlier. And the idea, wouldn't every org love to be able to say yes to just anything, but not have to incur the wrath of the risk that comes along with it? Well, one of the foundational components in the enterprise browser is a concept called an application boundary. And the idea behind that is that I want to create think of it like a virtual perimeter around the corporate apps. So the browser understands where corporate begins and where personal begins. So the user, for example, and this is true in many financial services firms I work within, they have historically blocked personal Gmail. It's a very common thing. And they block ChatGPT, obviously, naturally, as well, many other things too. But it's frustrating for the end users. They can't use personal mail at work because the corporate environment is worried that you're going to take data out of a corporate application and it's going to spill over into that personal usage, and we've lost control. And then maybe even blind spots with certain cipher suites and things like that where we can't break and inspect upstream effectively to be able to look inside of it. So we literally might have data fly out the window in personal apps. So what we do is just block them. We use upstream firewall rules, proxy rules, SASE rules, whatever they may be, to filter out those things and say we don't want to allow access. But what an application boundary lets you do is let the user have free access to those things. We called it shadow IT before. I just call it say yes, because the boundary keeps the data from spilling from the corporate app to the personal app, because we maintain the context of where the data originated from. The data originated in this corporate app over here. I won't let it spill over to things I don't know about, but I will let it spill to these 3 corporate apps. And the principle behind it is, what if I take a different approach to data protection with this? Therefore, I maintain custody of my data at all times. It's just spilling into my corporate apps into different tenants, but it's not spilling to places I don't control. And that is a transformational way to think about protecting data, number one, but it also kicks the door open where this concept of shadow IT starts to diminish or go away, because data just doesn't spill to those places, and it's no different than you really working from or being at home on your home Wi-Fi. Corporate data never makes its way there from there. Well, they just happen to be in a similar window, but corporate data won't spill to that place. So that was a long-winded answer, so hopefully that was helpful.
No, actually, this kind of gets me into curiosity things that I might ask you after the call. But some of these are relevant for the call. But that's kind of neat. As I'm thinking about all this stuff and the construct that you're putting down, it kind of seems to me like we went down to this endpoint security, right? EDR, XDR, pick an DR, whatever. Yep. And the way that those leverage, that they're pretty handy. I mean, sometimes until they send out the wrong things, but they're pretty handy. So thinking about y'all's construct, and I think I read this actually on their website, not going to paraphrase a little bit, but basically lowest common denominator, right, which is the browser, like we've been talking about. So when you think of apps and engagement, when you think about bringing things into the browser experience like SSH, remote desktop, all these other fun stuff, you're really, in a sense, you're kind of taking the EDR, XDR construct, and you really are putting it right at the base layer of what's actually happening, right? Mm-hmm. So it's, I'm not saying do away with those tools by any means, but I'm kind of curious then from the boundaries perspective that you're discussing. So if I download, is it something along the lines of I download like a PDF, are we tracking that PDF in the sense if I go back and try to upload it into a private Gmail? Is that kind of the layer you're working at and maintaining that pulse check, right, on the data itself as it moves from browser down back to the browser for upload, things like that?
Indeed, and I think one of the key elements, this is the nature of, at its core, leveraging context for every aspect of the engagement. So it's something we haven't really hit on just yet. And obviously, by nature of the historic title of the show here, we've tried not to your point, we tried not to exploit that terminology around zero trust. We let people make their own decisions. We certainly will explain, how it fits a general zero trust philosophy, but context drives everything. Context is the key. And so for us, context will drive the behavior of things like files, for example. And let me use an example. The browser is context aware on identity because it's tied into your identity provider. Great. It knows who the users are. It knows their roles, things like that. The browser is device aware. So the browser can recognize, is it installed right now and running on a corporate-owned asset? Cool. Maybe we handle files a certain way there. It's a corporate-owned asset. We've got a full set of controls in the corporate environment. Maybe we're tightly regulating our devices, whatever it may be. But this person accessing this application is not on a corporate asset. They're on a third-party device. They may be a business process outsourcer. So based on that, the context might drive an entirely different behavior. For example, when a user goes to download a file, we'll force the file to be redirected over to corporate OneDrive. So the user can never have the file hit a disk of a machine you don't manage if you don't want it to. We'll send it to a storage location where they can go work with it because they can go into OneDrive and double click on it and edit it using the online tools or whatever options are available to them. But the idea is that the movement of data has fluidity to the appropriate destinations, but it still has fluidity into places where maybe the user was trying to do this, but we gracefully send them back over here. But we don't stop them from being able to do their work in the process, and that's the key, I think. If you look at historically the things we've done throughout my career, unfortunately too, part of this is the technology would just stop the end user, and this is where shadow IT comes in because they're stopped from doing something. So now they feel this compulsion to go try to find their way through it, rather than being shepherded gently over to the landing place you want. I want to shepherd you over to the sanctioned AI environment. I want to shepherd you over to a place where the files should be stored over here. I want to make sure that the data doesn't flow to the wrong place, but it can flow to the right places in a natural, fluid way. And I think that's a big thing about the enterprise browser. It's all about user experience. User experience drives everything in this. And that way, at the end of the day, the users don't feel this desire or need because they get the outlet, they get their itch scratched without the org finding risk in how their data is maintained or managed by the end user. Hopefully that was helpful, Neal.
No, I like it. I appreciate it. So on that note, let's say from a policy perspective, you don't have something like an AI policy in place, right, to redirect, or you don't have your own corporate AI, whatever it may be. So in this perspective, I'm assuming based off the way the browser works, you probably get a fairly standard lockdown, hey, this doesn't exist, or solicit for this kind of process flow. But if I go out and hit chatgpt.com, what happens at that point? Is it just locked down in the sense of, sure, it pulls it up, but you're not going to be blatantly copy pasting things over, or how does that functionality, or their echelons, I guess, would be?
Well, there's a few ways to think about it. Depends on how the org wants to attack it. Well, one simple way is leveraging the concept of the data boundary or application boundary that I talked about a moment ago. If you want to let the user have freedom, they can go to all these things. It doesn't matter. There's corporate data just won't spill beyond the boundary, so there's no risk there. Now, I may apply outside of the boundary some appropriate data loss prevention policies. For example, when someone tries to do an input of a social security number or some common vernacular that would be part of the lexicon I have in the organization for my traditional DLP, I could apply that. And we can integrate to the existing DLP technologies you've got to be able to apply those policies too. You're not having to throw away all the stuff you've got. You're just using it a lot less because the application boundary takes care of the heavy lifting. And so now you're selectively using the old school approaches to DLP that you've made investments in. So that's one way to approach it, 100%. Second way to approach it is, well, maybe I want to have selective or opportunistic access to these things. And, maybe we want to apply that against our enterprise workflows we already have. And when I say enterprise workflows, you've already got a ticketing environment like ServiceNow or Jira or something like that. So rather than the user, again, going back to the conversation about block earlier, what if the page said request access, and you request access, and then as they do, they just naturally open a ticket right in the enterprise browser. It flows to the business decision makers in the process. When the business decision makers approve it, it actually gets approved, and the policy exception gets approved without involving a frontline practitioner, taking the burden off of the cybersecurity folks that are already drowning in constant creation of exceptions all day long. And then, by the way, I'm sure you guys will appreciate this, is, we get these long lists of exceptions, and we forget where they all came from. So we don't know which ones to clean up later on. But what if they could be self-resolving so that after a period of time, or the policy hasn't been hit, auto-expire those policies and they're cleaning themselves up automatically in that case as well. But the end user, again?
I said, what a novel idea.
Yeah. But the idea for it is, what if we could make the relationship between the end user and the application provider, and the only intermediary is a business decision maker in the process that would allow the decisions to be made by business decision makers without having to let cybersecurity practitioners be focused on protecting the organization in the effective way they should.
I like it. So I'm going to take us back a step. We kind of started to poke the SBOM concept a little bit. So I'm very curious about your take on, with AI in mind, going about maybe creating that SBOM and figuring out if and where possible, just how far down the LLM rabbit hole tool is taking you, if they're not as easy. Is there kind of constructs to figure out, the SBOM around that idea? I need to know if it's Gemini versus ChatGPT versus these random one-offs that are taking things out there and passing them along, and then combine that with normal SBOM along the rest of the flow for all my weird stuff.
Yeah, listen, so I think there are a number of great providers out there that are doing great work on SBOM technologies to be able to give you feeds for where those things come from. So those would be easy things to tie into, and then you create policies based on those feeds. And again, you leverage those providers who have got those they've got a whole set of researchers whose job it is to work with the providers to make sure we understand the bill of materials of what's contained in the applications. And at the end of the day, just like, by the way, the same thing is true with the extension ecosystem, by the way, too. You think about the extension ecosystem, there's a whole set of things those extensions do that the average user and the practitioner doesn't understand. That's something we do as well, just exposing you to what's this extension about to do in your environment Are you sure you want to allow that to happen? Let's put some parameters around it when they can and when we can let them effectively operate or not. That's no different than an application provider, and we would just leverage again a third-party provider to be able to feed that, and via the foundational APIs we have, those are easy types of integrations to be able to pull off.
I like that. That's kind of neat. I like policy procedures based off the SBOMs for obvious reasons. And then I'm an Intel guy. I don't know if Elliot warned you or not, but I'm an Intel analyst by trade. So I ask a lot of weird random questions that do eventually make connections. I promise. It's just sometimes my dots are way out here before they get back to here.
All right.
No, that's cool. So where's it going? Unless I forget. But when we think about so we got the SBOM, we got policy procedures around SBOM and being able to manage that. I think that's a big win for most people. And outside of just what y'all are doing, I think there's been kind of a cool resurgence around, not resurgence, but just uptick. It's not even resurgence, but just a growth in the idea of taking those SBOM packages and then building these policies and procedures around them, and then maybe auto approving based off of the types of firmware or the solutions within that data set because it matches X, Y, and Z security policies. So that being kind of the growth part here. Moving back into AI a little bit more, do you see methodologies or intent outright, like to blatantly get AI to help you circumvent certain IT policies? So back from AI, using it to get you back into the shadow side of the house blatantly, other than just the standards, like people write scripts, there's some concern with that sometimes, but like literally using AI to pull up things and do things, whether in the browser or outside, to get you around other stuff, right?
Well, I'll tell you what, I can't speak to a specific example where somebody has tried this, but I'll tell you what I see AI doing, and this I think it will be applied in the same way you're asking this question, is one of the challenges let's just go back to old school DLP, for example. One of the challenges with old school DLP, and you guys will probably shake your heads wildly at this one, is the nature of how we attack the problem by attacking tactical data. Mm-hmm. And the issue is tactical data is living and breathing and changes, and it comes in many forms. And we would love all of our tactical data to exist in structured form. Because if it just exists in structured form, I can build a bunch of regexes and identify it all. The problem with structured form is even then there are variants, there are all kinds of variables of what that structure could look like. So I better be pretty good at building policies around those types of things. And they have their place and they could be useful. The challenge when it gets into unstructured data is the Wild West. You think about the notes in a physician's field in an application. The physician doesn't type the notes to conform to your DLP policy. Your DLP policy is chasing the physician's notes to keep up. But the problem is the physician's typing the notes in an unstructured way. Now let's go back to the question you asked. What you get with many of these technologies, generative AI-based technologies, the ability to fling off a ton of different forms of derivative data. So now I have data that is identical to my data, but in a different derivative form. It has different semantics with it, for example. Different things that, it might use different words or different things that are not a part of my normal lexicon. So what this forces, and I think this is why I think what we're doing is so powerful around this concept of application boundaries and how we deal with fields and applications as well. Many times we need to deal with things that we just don't know what the structure, and we can't predict what the structure is. So what I can predict what the structure will be is what are the apps that are being used in the org? Because the apps aren't moving that fast, the legitimate sanctioned apps. So bringing them into the boundary at the appropriate time is acceptable. Therefore, it helps me build a construct that helps me deal with not unstructured data. And back to your comment before, end users, I could certainly see end users taking advantage of AI engines to create derivative forms of my data that escape my traditional policies. I did a test a few weeks ago, and I just plugged in a social security number into ChatGPT. And I said, give me some variable forms of this. And it just started pouring forth just hundreds of different variants. I got to build a regex to identify every one of those. Well, I'll never do it with structured data. And then what if I know that field in the application has physician's notes as the example I mentioned before? What if I could just redact that field and just take care of it all in one fell swoop? For this audience of users, in this contextual situation, back to the context we talked about earlier, that field's redacted. And for this audience of users, they have the ability to go through an authentication process to unredact that data. But again, it's unstructured. Again, I'm mixing a few things here, but it all boils down to derivative forms of our data that the end user is in that some maybe maliciously in your example trying to get through. Sometimes they may be inadvertently using AI that's creating this, but the explosion of derivative data is a massive potential for potential abuse and or just accidental leakage.
You gave me some not safe ideas just now. I'm going to go back and try this in mine, but I'm kind of curious if I can get it like the Social Security number, spit it out some things that I can't really understand, basically some form of hash or encrypting, but not really, right? And then take it back to ChatGPT and let ChatGPT figure out what it's supposed to be, again, on a 100%. Different box. This has already done and been done 100 times over, but now I'm just kind of curious to see what I can do.
Right.
Anyway, no, that's pretty. That's actually kind of a fun one, though. You know, circumventing policy by creating different data standards that, once again, only maybe the bot really understands. So needing a bot to catch it before it goes out the door. So that's kind of fun. Wheels are spinning. Sorry, Elliot. That's where the brain went. So back on the browser side of the house. So once again, I've always been, like I mentioned earlier, I've always been very intrinsically curious about browser security and browser apps and how what we can and can't do, whether it's just standard like we talked about a minute ago, it's just a browser, do things, or whether it's this enterprise type construct, right? And when it comes to porting in apps, whether like you mentioned RDP, SSH, things like that, to interact with, structural curiosity. Are y'all legitimately still opening up ports directly through that, or is there some kind of centralized service flow that's monitored structurally, or is it, I mean, obviously for the end user, I'm in SSH, but when it goes through the browser, are we still able to use and leverage like 443 from that point to whatever that central service is, and then stay fixated on monitoring that layer until it gets to wherever we're SSHing to, I guess is the best way to think about it?
That's exactly right. So everything's encapsulated in your standard web-based ports. And then on the other end, to the inside of the environment, obviously the Linux server inside needs the appropriate ports to support secure shell available. Yeah. And then, obviously the upstream is just a pass-through. At the end of the day, the client itself is certainly communicating the appropriate protocol. But from anything that's looking at the browser from the outside, sitting beside the browser, is seeing standard web protocols and encrypted web protocols at that, by the way, obviously using SSL over all the communications there. And then obviously leveraging private access, riding atop that private access tunnel with the appropriate internal protocol necessary to access that server is exactly what happens. And at the end of the day, for the end user and the environment, the one thing I think is really important in this whole thing, nowhere in the process do I need to inspect within that tunnel. Do I need to do break and inspect? This is a very important takeaway for an enterprise browser. The mechanics for the policies and governance are living locally in the browser. As a result, we're not having to pass traffic upstream, break and inspect SSL to look inside of it like a lot of providers done. And that's, by the way, that's my history and things. I worked in proxies and upstream technologies with DLP, et cetera. So you get into the whole break and inspect mechanics of now having to reestablish trust with the man in the middle that is upstream, that's a legitimate man in the middle. We just don't have to do that stuff because the mechanics live locally in the browser itself. So you don't have to tamper with or manipulate SSL in any of that process to get full control, complete fidelity over the process. Because the browser naturally terminates SSL, and the mechanics live right after the SSL termination before data hits the glass of the screen. So it's in a very unique physical position. We call it the last mile. It's truly the last mile physical position of the presentation of the applications.
I'm going to ask a fun question because of Elliot structurally here. What's y'all's take on the leverage of VPN tech for this process flow?
Well, at the end of the day, orgs have all kinds of different conduits to get to applications. Some orgs may be wrapped around the axle on the VPN they use. That's great. Use it. Great. Our browser will ride atop that VPN and access your internal applications. However, I do think, there's an analogy that I'll use here. At one point, the horse and carriage were necessary. And then at some point, the automobile came along and we said, all right, well, maybe there's an easier way to do this. So that is the nature of why we built in Zero Trust Network Access natively to the browser, so that you could have an alternative path that the user doesn't have to go launch an external client, log in there, then log in somewhere else. At the end of the day, they log into the browser, recognize the context of who they are, the role they are, and for the given applications that are entitled for that user, empower them to have the conduit to the internal applications that are necessary to do their jobs. And no more, no less. But the best part is it's an arm's length relationship, especially for unmanaged devices, BYO and things like that. The BYO device has access to the internal apps, but it's not domain joined. It doesn't need to be. It still has access to the internal applications, and the BYO machine is not actually on my network. So it hasn't actually joined my network in any way. So again, it's an arm's length separation. So I don't have some of the risks that could be associated with, now suddenly on a VPN client, the entire device is on my network. And maybe I'm doing some split tunneling or something, but at the end of the day, the device is, some aspect of the device is on my network. I don't have that issue here. But again, at the end of the day, if an org has its own preferred path, whether they've got their own upstream SASE provider that has private access, they got their own VPN client, or they want to leverage our built-in VPN or leverage our own built-in private access, great. At the end of the day, the important thing is that we get access to the application and you give the user access to the application and use last mile for governance that we talked about earlier.
You just made Elliot's Christmas list. I think maybe 2 years ago or so when we were first really getting started, I think Elliot was this close to just doing an entire episode on VPN bashing.
Yeah, now we just spread it out evenly.
No, that's awesome. Let's see. Elle, is there anything else that was on your mind?
Oh yeah, there sure is.
I'll let him
and I don't
talk
know if
every
you're
once in a
going
while.
to feel comfortable talking to this particular subject. It's kind of a weird one, but in the past life, I've worked for an organization that did provide zero trust network access.
Mm-hmm.
As part of that, there's usually an agent that you put on there. Even with like device management, there's usually some sort of thing there. Inevitably, there's someone that will speak to the world. They'll go to forums, Reddit, wherever. They're like, is this tracking me? How much can this see? Is it logging every keystroke? Stuff of that nature. Obviously, everything is contained within the browser. There's not a little thing there. Do you feel like that eases minds because it's just sort of captured within there? You have to understand if I'm putting stuff into this box, our IT security teams are probably seeing it, but like I'm just curious if you've run into that, if you feel like this helps ease some of that concern.
Yeah, actually, it's probably one of the most graceful answers to these difficult problems. And now let's go to the most extreme example. And by the way, all the others are much easier, but let's go to BYO. The age-old problem of BYO. And the age-old problem of BYO is, let's just go to your agent comment. Who wants your company's agent on your personal device? But so you give me the agent for access to your applications or your VPN client or whatever it is, you're going to put a DLP client on, you're going to put a DLP agent on my host? No, you're not going to. So there's been this tension between the org and the BYO thing, which keeps a lot of orgs from actually embracing it in the way that we'd hoped it would. And it's still kind of a continual conversation. You're never going to get your agent on their machine, or at least they don't want you there, and you probably don't want to be there anyway, because but you're just at a standoff, because you've got to go far enough to protect your application data and give them access. But every time you go far enough, you're overly invasive. So the great part about this technology is that the user keeps using Chrome, Edge, and Safari in their personal browser for personal and non-critical work. When they engage the critical application, we gracefully bounce them over, just like a Zoom meeting, bounce them over into the enterprise browser just for the corporate applications. Now, we don't see anything. The enterprise browser never sees anything unless the user's doing corporate application work. And by the way, the org then has the ability, and this is something nice because we control the presentation layer, we can layer communication vehicles over the application. Because in many geographies, there's the right to know for the end user from a privacy standpoint. You may want to layer objects to state the nature of what they're engaging and how they're being monitored if they are, and or suppress it. So we can use attributes to decide, is this device safe for us to access? Is the posture appropriate? Is it got appropriate endpoint control? Has it got full disk encryption? Is it patched appropriately? Because I want those things to be true as they're going to access our applications. At the same time, I can use those for assessment and then suppress certain data that the org thinks is necessary to suppress from a user's device and or a third party's device to give both sides comfort in the process. So I get comfort that we're still inspecting and understanding and using context to drive posture or understanding of posture and things like that, but we're not overly reporting in the process either. But again, communication to the user is key. And that's why we control the presentation layer. We throw boxes over the screen that give the user the chance to protest if they don't want to be monitored here, and warn them ahead of time. All that kind of stuff, again, is often missing from the upstream technologies, where the user just goes wandering into something. No, they don't know where their data's gone. They don't know when they're being monitored. They don't know anything because the browser they're using for the apps is consumer oriented, and the upstream technologies aren't communicating in the process either.
Yeah, I mean, I think the other thing is this is a huge benefit from like cost savings for IT, maybe cybersecurity adjacent. If you have contractors, instead of sending them a approved device and having to go through all that, just say, hey, you don't have to put this kind of sketchy agent on there, which again, I hear complaints about that. Just use this browser, contain everything within there, you should be good to go.
Yep. That is a super common use case, a very easy starting point for the enterprise browser. Amongst many, I mean, the use cases are, I mean, when I say they're endless, they're truly endless. I see new ones every day, but an unmanaged device for a contract firm, like you're a financial services firm, you've outsourced to a business process outsourcer your call center. They've got 2,000 call center workers and you're not wanting to ship them all devices, and they're wanting to use their devices anyway. So what if I could strike a nice balance in there and give them access to the browser? Boom, they're onboarded in a matter of seconds, because the onboarding process is literally, have you ever downloaded Chrome and installed Chrome from an app store from their download page? If you've ever done that, you're trained to use the enterprise browser. That's your training. So it is a really nice vehicle it's probably the most elegant vehicle I've ever seen for onboarding a third-party scenario, of which every large organization's got some facet in their supply chain of something that's accessing resources. Sometimes in the healthcare environment, they're calling them physicians, and they're actually contracted to work for the hospital they work for, but they work for their own practice. Sometimes they're in the financial services world where they're call center agents, or sometimes they're brokers representing a portfolio of products for the company. You know, they have these non-captive agents that represent a wide array of investment vehicles, and you go to the local firm, you work with your local investment person, they're actually representing portfolio or company XYZ, and they got to access those applications. So that's a form of third-party situation that numbers in many organizations, the tens to hundreds of thousands of people. So there's many different shapes and sizes. Sometimes they're franchisees. You've got a massive footprint of global, storefronts, and at the end of the day, we don't own the stores, the franchisees own them. They're on their devices. So we see those all the time, numbering. I got one org that numbers, between 500,000 and 600,000 people in the franchisee world. So that's, these aren't small numbers here, but it is a good starting point.
All right, Neal. That is where I get to offer you the final question if you want it. Otherwise, we can wrap it there.
No, actually, I think I'm good. I love this concept, I'll say, because, like you mentioned earlier on, Bradon, we talked about virtualization of the browser and how that evolved and how we were capturing things to thick client, thin client, to kind of funny bringing it back down into like a thick client mentality back on the box, but still everything's hyper-threaded to some kind of extent, or technically virtualized through the browser for what it needs to be, by proxy of most apps being in the website of this space anyways. So I think it's kind of fun. I like it. It really is getting us into that lowest common denominator, and bonus points, you can't accidentally send a BIOS update that crashes the whole computer. So, but yeah, I think that's it, man. I mean, I like it. This is the fun stuff. I like this stuff like this. This is cool. Thank you very much.
That's awesome. Thank you guys for having me. I appreciate you being with me today.
All right. Well, that takes us to the end of the episode. Thank you for tuning into Adopting Zero Trust. I'm Elliot. That was Neal. And thank you so much, Bradon, for joining us.
Thank you for listening to AZT, an independent podcast. Your hosts have been Neal Dennis and Elliot Volkman. To learn more about the series, catch past episodes, or about Zero Trust, go to adoptingzerotrust.com. You can also subscribe to our newsletter for additional insights. Viewpoints expressed during this show do not reflect the brands or employers of our hosts or guests.